By the spring of 1875, the granite and limestone tower rising from the Brooklyn shore of the East River had already climbed past the rooftops around it, and the men setting stone at the top were working with nothing over their heads but open sky. There was no crane on that site in the sense the word would come to mean within a few decades, no rotating boom on a fixed mast that one man could run with a single lever. What stood on top of the unfinished tower was a wooden hoisting rig built on site by the bridge company's own carpenters, driven by a steam engine bolted to a timber platform, and that rig was the only machine standing between a block of quarried stone weighing several tons and a resting place roughly 276 feet above the water. Every stone that went into that tower, and into its twin rising on the New York side of the river, had to travel that entire height hanging from a rope, guided into place by hand, and set into a joint that had to be right within a fraction of an inch, or the coursed wall above it would carry the error upward for the rest of the structure's life. This is the story of how that problem was solved, one block at a time, in a country that did not yet build cranes the way we understand the word today. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The bridge those two towers belonged to did not exist yet in any completed sense in 1875, and the reason it was being built at all had been obvious to anyone who lived in Brooklyn or Manhattan for a decade. The East River between the two cities was not a river you could bridge with the technology of the 1700s or even the early 1800s. It was tidal, deep, busy with ship traffic headed for two of the busiest ports in the country, and in a hard winter, it filled with moving ice that could trap a ferry for hours, with passengers standing on deck in the cold. Brooklyn, by this point, was the third largest city in the United States in its own right, and every morning, tens of thousands of people crossed the river by steam ferry to reach jobs in Manhattan, then crossed back every evening. A bridge across open, tidal, ship-traveled water at that width had never been attempted anywhere in the world at the scale being proposed. The engineer who designed it, John Roebling, had already built wire cable suspension bridges over the Ohio River and the Niagara Gorge, and he believed the same principle: cables strong enough to hold the deck, towers tall enough to let the cables do their work, could span the East River too. He never saw his design leave the drawing stage. In the summer of 1869, while surveying the exact spot where the Brooklyn Tower would stand, his foot was crushed between a ferryboat and the pilings of the dock. The injury became infected, then developed into tetanus, and he died a few weeks later. His son, Washington Roebling, who had worked at his side on earlier bridges and had built and destroyed bridges for the Union Army during the Civil War, took over as chief engineer in his early 30s and inherited a project that had not yet placed a single stone of either tower. The first years of construction went into the foundations, not the towers themselves, and that part of the story belongs elsewhere, but it matters here because of what it did to the man in charge. Both towers needed to rest on solid ground far below the riverbed, and reaching that depth under a tidal river meant sending men down inside enormous timber and iron boxes called caissons, sealed and pressurized with compressed air to hold the water and mud back while they dug. Washington Roebling went down into the caissons himself, repeatedly, and by 1872 he was suffering from what the workers already had a name for, even though medicine did not yet understand it. They called it caisson disease, or simply the bends, and it left him in pain for the rest of his life, largely confined to a room overlooking the work site for the next decade. He never again set foot on the towers he was building. He watched their progress through a telescope from his window, and his wife, Emily Warren Roebling, who had taught herself enough engineering and mathematics to follow his instructions, became the daily link between the chief engineer and the men actually setting the stone hundreds of feet above the water. For years, most of the workforce on the East River believed the person arriving with the engineer's instructions was simply a messenger. She was running the project. By the time the foundations were finished and the masonry began rising above the waterline, the real work of this story could begin. The towers were built as solid masonry, faced in granite with a limestone core, coursed upward in a stepped, tapering form that widened at the base and narrowed near the top, where two pointed Gothic arches would eventually be cut through the stone to carry the roadway deck. The dressed stone came from quarries well outside the city, cut to specified dimensions by stonecutters before it ever reached the river, then brought to the site by barge and unloaded at the foot of the rising tower. Every block had already been cut once before it reached the tower, squared and finished at the quarry to the exact dimensions called for on the drawings, because there was no practical way to trim or dress a stone once it was hanging from a rope 200 feet above the water. A stonecutter's error made on solid ground was a problem that could be fixed on solid ground. The same error, discovered after a block had already gone up, meant lowering several tons of granite back down, which nobody wanted to do twice in the same afternoon. The barges themselves ran on a schedule tied to the tide and to the pace of the crew above, since there was no point stacking stone faster than the traveller could lift it, and no point letting the traveller sit idle, waiting on a barge that was running late. From that point forward, every single block belonged to the hoisting crew. The apparatus that lifted that stone was called a traveller, and it was as much a piece of carpentry as it was a machine. It sat on top of the unfinished tower itself, a heavy timber frame built to straddle the working masonry, with a boom that could swing out over either face of the tower and a block and tackle rigged through iron sheaves at its head. A steam engine, hauled up in pieces and reassembled on the tower deck, turned a drum that wound in the hoisting rope. As the tower gained height, the traveller had to be raised with it, taken partly apart, lifted, and rebuilt higher on the new masonry, again and again, for as long as the tower kept climbing. The engineer who ran the hoisting engine controlled the entire operation through a set of levers and a signal system worked out between himself and the men on the wall, since the noise of the steam engine and the wind at that height made shouted instructions useless past a few feet. A tug on a signal rope, a raised hand, a set number of strikes on an iron bar. This was the vocabulary of a job where a misread signal could mean several tons of moving granite swinging into a man's back instead of settling into its bed. The hoisting crews were drawn largely from the pool of stonemasons, riggers, and general labourers who had already built the docks, the tenements, and the earlier bridges of a city that never stopped constructing something, and a large share of them were Irish immigrants or the American-born sons of Irish immigrants who had learned this kind of work on other jobs before this one. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Setting a single block began well before the stone ever left the barge. A rigger went over the piece with iron dogs, curved clamps that bit into sockets cut into the stone for that purpose, and chain slings run through the dogs and up to the main hook of the traveller. Nothing left the ground until the rigger had checked every sling and every dog at least twice, because a stone that shifted or slipped even a few inches while hanging over open air could not be caught by hand. Once the load was secure, the engineer opened the steam valve and the drum began winding in rope. The block came up slowly and deliberately, rising past the scaffolding at a pace closer to a slow walk than anything resembling speed, because speed was the enemy of control at that height. As the stone cleared the top of the wall, the boom swung it inward over the working face of the tower, and this was the moment that demanded the most coordination in the entire process. 2 or 3 masons stood on the wall itself, on a working platform sometimes no more than a few planks wide, reaching up to guide the block by hand as it descended toward its bed of fresh mortar. They could not simply let it drop the last few inches and hope for the best. The joint below had to receive the stone at the correct angle, aligned with the course beneath it and the string line marking the tower's true face, and the men doing that guiding were doing it with their bare hands on several tons of suspended granite hanging from a rope over a drop of more than 200 feet. Once the block was seated and checked against a plumb line and a level, the mortar joint was packed and struck, and the traveller swung back out empty for the next piece. On a good day, with dry weather, a cooperative wind, and no delays from the barges below, A hoisting crew could set several dozen blocks between sunrise and dark. On a bad day, wind off the river strong enough to swing a suspended load unpredictably could stop the hoisting entirely, because no engineer would risk lowering several tons of stone into a crowd of masons if he could not control exactly where it went. Winter brought a separate set of dangers. Mortar cured more slowly in the cold, hemp rope stiffened and became harder to inspect for fraying, and ice on the scaffold planks turned an already narrow footing into something worse. The men working the upper courses of both towers through the winters of 1873 and 1874 were doing precision stonework at height in conditions that would close down most construction sites built to modern safety rules. There was no safety net strung beneath the working deck, and no harness clipped to a fixed line, nothing between a mason's boots and the water 200 feet down except his own balance and the width of the plank he stood on. A dropped tool from that height could kill a bargeman working below just as easily as a dropped stone could kill a mason above, so the hoisting crews worked out their own informal rules: a shout before anything left a hand, a fixed path for climbing the scaffolding, so nobody crossed beneath a suspended load, even for a moment. None of it was required by any regulation. It was simply what men who wanted to keep working at that height, day after day, worked out for themselves. The full record of injury and death specific to the tower masonry, as distinct from the far better documented casualties of the underwater caisson work, has never been assembled into a single reliable count. Newspapers covered the bridge constantly, since it was one of the most watched construction projects in the country, and serious accidents at the tower sites did make the papers when they happened. A fall from scaffolding, a man struck by a swinging block, a length of hoisting rope parting under load. What the surviving record does not offer is a complete tally, because the bridge company's own internal accident logs from this phase of the work have not survived in full, and a project run for more than a decade by a private company answered to no city or state agency that required every laborer's injury to be reported. How many men were hurt or killed doing this specific part of the job, setting the stone of the towers by hand, hundreds of feet above the water, is a number nobody alive today can give you with certainty. The Brooklyn Tower reached its full height in the summer of 1875, and the New York Tower followed roughly a year behind it, both finished off with the pointed Gothic arches that would eventually frame the roadway deck between them. For a while, before any cable connected them, the two towers stood alone across the river from each other, the tallest structures in either city, visible from ships miles out at sea, built entirely by hand from stone that had traveled up on a wooden rig powered by steam. In the summer of 1876, once the first strand of wire had been strung between the two towers, the bridge's master mechanic, E.F. Farrington, rode a boatswain's chair hung from that single wire across the full width of the river, while crowds on both banks watched and cheered, the first man to cross the East River without a boat beneath him. It was a small, almost theatrical moment, but it marked the point where the towers stopped being the entire story and became the anchor points for the cable spinning that would eventually let the bridge carry a deck at all. The traveler and the steam donkey engine that built those towers did not last as a construction method much beyond the turn of the century. As American cities began building upward in steel rather than stone, contractors needed a machine that could climb inside a rising steel skeleton rather than sit balanced on top of a masonry wall, and dedicated hoisting cranes, built specifically for repeated vertical lifting rather than adapted from ship rigging and mill equipment, took over the job. By the middle of the 20th century, the rotating, self-climbing tower crane had become the standard tool on almost every large building site in the country, and the wooden traveler, rebuilt by hand at every new height on every new bridge, was gone. What has not disappeared is the stone itself. Both towers of the Brooklyn Bridge still stand exactly where the hoisting crews of the 1870s left them, carrying a working roadway across the East River more than a century and a half after the first block went up on a rope, guided into place by men whose names mostly never made it into any surviving record at all. The bridge was named a National Historic Landmark in 1964, and it still carries pedestrian and vehicle traffic across the East River every single day. One of the oldest suspension bridges in the country, still doing the job it was built for. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.